But yes, my name's Brent Buchanan. I'm president and founder of Signal, which is actually the fastest growing polling firm in the United States right now. I'm an Alabama boy, but before that I grew up in Peachtree City, just on the south side here, and love Georgia, love the South, and just grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for coming to this. I mean, you took a Friday and a Saturday to come out and to hear from folks, hear from a number of great presidential candidates, from folks who are leading this country. You've got a program beyond this that's incredible and going to close out strong with Governors Youngkin and Kemp, who are two of my favorite folks in politics right now. So we do polling work, everything from presidential campaigns down to state legislative races and county commission races. I have the honor, as Erick had mentioned, of working with Governor Kemp. We also work with Governor Abbott of Texas, and with both caucuses here in Georgia, the Republican caucuses, and 23 other ones. And so we get to see a lot of data from around the country on a regular basis. But as I look at Georgia specifically, I see a state that is red, that is not necessarily voted red the last couple elections. They did with people like Governor Kemp. They don't with other candidates that present a certain way. So as we walk through the data this morning, I'm going to show you a survey that we just conducted last week, and I want to thank Hardworking Americans, who's co-sponsor of this. That's Governor Kemp's federal effort for paying for this survey and for allowing me to be here today to show it to y'all. You're the first people to see it, of anybody here. And I want to start with a raise of hands. Everybody raise your hand if you think America is headed in the right direction. Okay. I was expecting 8% of the crowd to respond, because somehow we found 8% of people here. If I can get to go to the next slide. There we go. Most people in Georgia, this is Georgia Republican primary voters. That's most of the data we're going to be talking through here today. They don't think the country's headed in the right direction. So I'm glad that you here also agree with that data point. And something I'm going to be pointing out in a lot of this data is kind of three buckets of people. And we'll get to that in a few slides here. And it's Republican primary voters who only would vote for Donald Trump. Then Republican primary voters who are considering Trump, but also one or more of the other candidates, many of which you got to hear yesterday and today. And then there's a bucket of folks who are those who would never vote for Donald Trump, and they'll take anybody else. So again, these are just Georgia Republican primary voters here that we're talking through. And I think this slide is very indicative of where we are as a country, not just as Republicans and conservatives, but it's very clear to see we're just not headed down the direction of what we used to see. Can anybody tell me, I'm just looking for a shout out of what Donald Trump's red hats say? What do they say on them? What was that last word? Again. So that means what? We used to be great and we're not great today. That's how many of us feel. And we look around us and the world is changing drastically. And it's changing quickly, and it's going pretty far to the left. And that's what's driving much of this right now, of this feeling here. And so when we look at what's going on within Georgia specifically, again, this is Georgia Republican voters, they feel a lot better about the direction of this state. I think outside of maybe some of the Democrat victories at the Senate level here, the U.S. Senate level in Georgia, the last cycle, these numbers would be a lot higher. They'd be in the 70s or 80s. But Georgia Republican primary voters are concerned about what they're seeing around them, what's happening to the state. I mean, if you go back, 3-4 cycles, this was a 10-plus point Republican state. And I think Governor Kemp gives us a really good path of the type of Republican that swing voters and all voters are looking for from us. And it's our responsibility as Republican primary voters to pick that individual that is going to have the chance to win in the next election, to win whatever seat we're electing them for, from county commission to governor to president. And as we look at the top issue, so this is, many of us care about many issues, but sometimes voters have to think about it in terms of okay, what are the one or two things I'm going to have to make this decision based off? Because I can't find somebody who agrees with me on everything. So what are the issues that I'm going to focus on? And I look to you, the people in this room here, who are taking your Friday and Saturday off to come learn more and to hear more and to educate yourselves more. And you have a responsibility in the Republican primary. There's voter records. And every time you vote, it goes into the Secretary of State's office, and that becomes publicly available information. And I would guess that many of you in this room are what we call, in the political world, 4 of 4 voters, that you voted in 4 of the last 4 elections that you were eligible to vote in. I would bet that almost every one of you falls within that bucket. And the reason this is important is because you 4 of 4 voters in this room are the ones who get to touch and meet the candidates more often than folks. You're more active on social media. You're talking to your sphere of influence, whether that's at church or the grocery store. You have a lot of impact in what the candidates are going to say. Because when we conduct surveys and we take this data to the people that we're working for, like Governor Kemp or a presidential candidate, they're looking at what do the most attuned voters think? What are they paying attention to? How are they thinking? What issues are they concerned about? And I'll tell you, if you were to watch Fox News, for example, you would not think that inflation is the #1 issue of primary voters. By far. It's far and away the plurality issue. And so and this is really important because this is also the #1 issue by far, even more so than you're seeing in this survey of Republican primary voters in Georgia, of swing voters. It's almost 50% the most important issue. So we have a responsibility as those perfect 4-4 voters, as the people who have spheres of influence, that we're making sure the candidates realize they know where we stand on the issues and that they understand what matters to us, because that's going to drive what they talk about. And if we're spending our time tweeting about the culture wars all the time, what do we think the candidates are going to talk about to get elected in primaries? They're going to talk about the culture wars because they saw people like you talking about the culture wars all the time. Well, you know what? Regular voters they want the country to get back on the right track. And they want inflation to come down. They want our economy to be strengthened. They want illegal immigration to be addressed. Folks who aren't really fans of President Trump, they are also concerned about the economy as a whole, more so than just the inflation issue. And as we dive into some of this data, it's actually female voters, female Republican primary voters, that are even more concerned about inflation than any other issue by a larger margin. And this matters because you've probably heard the phrase suburban female voters, right? We hear that all the time in elections. It is a voter segment that in Governor Kemp's campaign in 2022, we paid a lot of attention to, because we knew if we could move the needle with that group of folks, that it would make a big difference in the margin. And if you look at where Herschel Walker was below water and where Governor Kemp was far above water, that was one of the voter groups that was a really big difference maker for his campaign. And so Republican primary voters are still in the same spot. So one of the questions that we always like to ask as pollsters, because it gives us an idea of how does somebody feel about a candidate for office? And it's a very simple question. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of this individual? Have you never heard of him or her? Or do you just have no opinion? And then we look at intensity with that. And that's why you see kind of the 2 different colors of blue and the 2 different colors of orange there. Because we're looking at, are you very favorable or are you somewhat favorable? When we advise candidates, especially folks who have never run for office before, we explain that there's a 3-rung ladder that you have to walk up with voters in order to earn their vote. They have to know who you are. They have to recognize who you are. They have to like you. Then they have to trust you. And then you're in the space to earn their vote. And so that's why what we call image, their favorability versus unfavorability versus you have no clue who these people are, is very important in what we do as pollsters to track how a race is progressing. Because you want your candidate's image to become more favorable. The reason that there are attacks in politics is you want your opponent's image to become less favorable so that you can earn and work your way up that ladder with voters. And so you'll see here that the most popular Republican in Georgia is actually Governor Brian Kemp, even more so than Donald Trump. And this makes a lot of sense because this guy won and got 3/4 of the vote in the Republican primary over a Trump-endorsed candidate in 2022. And so he's done a good job of governing from a conservative perspective and maintaining that strong favorability, that strong trust level with voters. And you'll notice here too that even though, and you'll see in a second, who people are choosing to currently support in the Republican primary in Georgia, there's some big differences. Georgia Republican primary voters actually like a number of these candidates. The reason that some of these candidates who are very well liked haven't broken through is they just haven't moved up the ladder. They're known, they're liked, but they haven't built that trust level. Donald Trump is a known entity. He's a known quantity. Every one of you in this room probably has a very strong opinion one way or the other about the guy. There's not a lot of ambiguity about how anyone on this planet or the United States or Georgia feels about Donald J. Trump. But the other candidates have a lot of room to grow for the most part. You'll notice here that former Vice President Mike Pence has what we call an upside down image. More people dislike him than like him. And then Chris Christie takes the cake, pun intended, with way more people disliking him than liking him. And then as you look at voters who would only consider voting for Donald Trump and no other candidate, this looks almost the same as the exact slide. I bet if I flip between the two, you'd have a hard time even seeing what the difference was. So people who are only considering Donald Trump still actually do like a number of the other candidates unless you're Mike Pence or Chris Christie, and then they dislike you even more there. So as we look at these individuals of the biggest bucket currently in the Republican primary for president are people who would consider Donald Trump and somebody else right now. That's the largest bucket of voters that's available. And so among these folks, you can see that all the candidates are still very well liked. And so you start to wonder, okay, why do we not see more movement within the race? Why is Donald Trump still kind of dominating here? And it's because he has moved further up the ladder with voters of know, like, and trust. And that is, as you have, I don't know how many, we're going to have 9 people on the debate stage next Wednesday, I believe, in Milwaukee. Make sure if you're like me, you would prefer to watch it the next morning because it starts at 9 p.m. and that's kind of late. I have 5 kids. They're all really young, so I need my sleep. I hope you may too. But it is 9 p.m. on Fox News next Wednesday. That they're known, they're decently known individuals. They just haven't moved up that ladder with voters in the same way that Donald Trump has. I want to show you something here before we move into kind of the meatier parts of the survey. And this is comparing Brian Kemp's image to Donald Trump's image among several key voter groups. So we have overall among men, among women, among college, among non-college educated voters. And the reason that I broke up the educational attainment piece here, I think this is something really important for us to realize as Republicans. How many of you have been Republican for more than 30 years? So most of the people in the room here have been Republican for more than 30 years. If you go back to the Republican Party of 30 years ago, it was actually the more educated, higher income base of a party. And then if you looked at what made the Democrat base, it was more working class, it was more blue collar, lower college educational attainment levels than Republican primary voters. And there's been a huge realignment, and it really came to a confluence with Donald Trump's election where the bases are flipping. Now the Democrats are the coastal elites, the most highly educated, and our base is now the folks who are the working class individuals. Governor Kemp speaks to this a lot where he says hardworking Georgians, hardworking Americans, and that's because that's our new base as a Republican Party. And as you look at all these groups, you can see that even among any of these gender or educational attainment that we look at here, Governor Kemp is very well liked. And the reason I keep bringing him up is one, is because he's my favorite client, one of my favorite clients to work with. Him and Marty are incredible people. But I also think he's on to something that these presidential candidates could really learn from more, and that is how to be authentic, how to talk to issues in ways that regular people talk about those issues, how to focus on the right topics. Within his campaign, last year, we basically had two themes. We were talking about the money in your pocketbook, and we were talking about crime and public safety. Those were our two themes that we hammered on throughout the entire campaign, and that's because that's what regular people cared about. And so he's done a great job maintaining that as he governs in his second term. So this is the buckets I was talking about. I didn't want to just start with this. I kind of wanted to lead into, because as pollsters, the way we look at things is almost like a funnel. We're looking at the big, broad things, and then as it gets more narrow and narrow, that's how we make determinations of what to spend time and energy and resource on for campaigns. And so I wanted to work through that of the know, like, trust on the ladder before we jumped into this. But you can see within Georgia, essentially half of the voters currently are saying, I'm open to voting for Donald Trump or one or more of the other candidates. As you look at the voter group that is about a quarter, it's Donald Trump only. This group is mostly male, non-college educated individuals. They over-index for this. If you're college educated and then even higher, up towards like PhD type level, these individuals are more likely to be in the never Trump, anybody but Trump column. And so you can even see within a Republican primary how that educational attainment that I was mentioning even plays itself out within a Republican primary. What was interesting to me is that evangelicals, which was really one of the key voter groups that helped Donald Trump rise to win the nomination in 2016, they're only 27% Trump only. And as you look at mainline Protestants, which are, when we ask this question of voters, it's Methodist, and so it's not your Southern Baptist type on the religion side. They're 32% anybody but Donald Trump. And you see this also play itself out in general elections on those mainline Protestants tend to be a little bit less conservative than your evangelicals are. So this next slide is looking at these groups of only Trump, Trump plus somebody else, never Trump. And you can see that somebody's ideology plays a very big role in which bucket of these three they're likely to fall into. So if a pollster like me were to ask you, are you extremely conservative, very conservative, somewhat moderate, liberal, you can see that those have a large bearing on how somebody views which candidates they're open to or not open to voting for. And to kind of break this out for you, about 20% of Georgia primary voters consider themselves extremely conservative. Those who say they're very conservative is a little over a third of voters, is the plurality. 28% say somewhat conservative, and then there's still 13% of voters who consider themselves moderate to liberal. Now, we have to remember that's within a Republican primary context. They're saying they're moderate to liberal as Republican primary voters, not necessarily that they are moderate or liberals in the sense of a general election, per se. So another question we look at, especially when you have a multi-candidate field like this, is who are you opening to considering? Because just because you may know somebody and have a favorable opinion of them, or a somewhat favorable opinion of them, you may not necessarily be willing to vote for these individuals. And so as you look at these blue bars here, what's really interesting is there are a huge number of voters here in Georgia who are willing to vote for Ron DeSantis. But you'll see in a second here that you see that dark blue. The second bar says Ron DeSantis. It's really dark blue. It says 28%. I'm going to give you a preview to where the ballot stands in Georgia today. He gets nowhere near that 28% right now. So, and I'll explain what I believe is driving that, because you can't ascertain everything from the data. So a lot of this tracks with image. I'll tell you this, not to rib on Chris Christie any more than I already have, but he's not going anywhere in Georgia. He may have some luck up in New Hampshire and some other states, but Georgia voters are not even looking remotely at Chris Christie currently. As you look at kind of the gray bars on the right side of the screen here are essentially a response of, I don't know where I stand. Because if you've never heard of the person and I'm asking you in a survey, would you consider voting for them? What's your likely response? Well, I don't know. I don't know who that person is. So the three candidates that I think, and I believe the debate's going to be a big driver in this, are most likely to start moving are who you heard from earlier, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, and Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota. Those are the three that you're likely going to see the most movement on in the polls over the next few weeks, because all three of them are going to be on the debate stage with the others. And then as we look at those considering Trump plus others, the numbers are still pretty similar. But you see Donald Trump just dominates this bucket of voters still, who are saying that that 48% of folks said I'm willing to vote for Donald Trump and somebody else. He's just absolutely dominating that bucket currently. And then as you look at the group that says, I'll vote for anybody but Donald Trump, this is where Nikki Haley actually starts to break out some. She's been a really fascinating candidate to watch because she had a really big splash coming in, and then it's gotten kind of quiet since then. But she has, at least within Georgia, been making inroads with voters who are saying, I'll vote for anybody but Donald Trump. So here's the ballot, is where it stands in Georgia today. Donald Trump is getting more than 50% of the vote, which helps you see that he is consolidating beyond that quarter of voters who are saying only Donald Trump is the only guy I would consider within this race. Again, male, non-college educated voters in Georgia, 66% of them are saying Donald Trump on the ballot. Extremely conservative voters, that 20% we were talking about, he's at 70% with that voter group. And then he's at 58% of those considering themselves very conservative. He's lowest with what group? College educated female voters in the Republican primary, which has always been a challenge for him electorally. And DeSantis, interestingly, does best with men over the age of 65, but he's still only at 19% with that voter group. It was a private survey, so I can't share the details with you, but I'll tell you, earlier this year, these numbers looked very different. The race was much closer, and there's been a significant movement of Donald Trump. Really, these indictments, I think, just brought so much attention to him. And DeSantis waited way too long to jump into the race. Way too long. If he had jumped in this race in December, I think we'd be talking about a totally different set of numbers here, had he gotten in right after he had that huge victory in Florida for his reelection. So as you look at, and this is what I was talking about, look at that middle chart right there. 57% of voters who are saying Trump plus others are in my consideration. He's winning that bucket of folks. So he's winning more than half of the largest bucket, in addition to having total dominance. The number was 96% of people saying I would only vote for Donald Trump actually selected him on the ballot when we asked the question of who are you looking to vote for now. And so this middle group of voters, this 48% of voters within Georgia that are Trump plus anybody else, are going to really make the difference here in the state in who is the nominee or who the electoral or the nomination votes go to for the convention. So this is a national primary, and you'll see there's actually been, I think, 7 polls or so come out since we did our national survey about a week and a half ago that showed Vivek Ramaswamy coming into second place, if not right behind DeSantis in third place. But still, the big takeaway is Donald Trump is still securing half of Republican primary voters nationally. And what's driving that nationally? The same trend. Donald Trump is dominating that center bucket of voters who are saying Trump plus some other candidate. And as long as he continues to do that, he's going to continue to stay in the 50% range that we're seeing here in Georgia. We're seeing the exact same number nationally. And this is a question that has been kind of a newer one that we've been asking is, are you interested in a Republican nominee who is advancing their own agenda or that of the Republican Party? Because I think during the Donald Trump era, we haven't really talked about what the Republican Party's agenda even is. It's been Donald Trump's agenda. And this tells me that these numbers here show us that middle bucket of voters can be incredibly instrumental in picking the next nominee. And what are people in Georgia using as their deciding factor of who to vote for? The number one is who can beat Joe Biden. Because isn't that the most important thing? Like, you may see here all these folks that are coming up here that Erick's getting to interview. And as you can see from the data, most everybody likes those people who are running. They're incredibly intelligent. It's a very diverse, it's probably the most diverse group we've ever had as a Republican Party that we're fielding as potential nominees for president. And we have to keep in mind that the most important factor is, how do we beat Joe Biden? because this country cannot afford 4 more years of Joe Biden. And then as we look at these individuals here of what are they looking for? The Trump voters are still with Trump. But what's really interesting to me is that this number wasn't higher, that they're looking for Trump or somebody that is supported by Trump. So less than half of Trump voters are still interested in other things. The second being defeating Joe Biden, illegal immigration pops up there. But you can see that those who are considering Trump and others and those considering anybody but Trump, beating Biden's an even more important factor to those voters within those two groups. And then what are some characteristics of somebody, of a presidential candidate our Georgia primary voters looking for? Well, they're looking for somebody with business experience. This actually really surprised me. I kind of thought that fighter would be the number one thing, because if you look at the way that Donald Trump acts and the other candidates you see act on in their interviews, is they're definitely coming across as a fighter. But it's not the number one issue. It is, though, the number two issue, followed by government experience. They want somebody who's had some experience within the government system. So I'm going to flip here to, and I'm going to close with 3 slides this is general election, because again, what's the most important thing that we can accomplish next November? Beat Joe Biden, because if we beat Joe Biden, we take back Congress, we take back the US Senate, and we have to have all 3 to make anything happen. You can see, thankfully we won the House of Representatives in this last election, and we could put a little bit of a brake tap on the liberal Democrat agenda. But things are really ripe for us as a party to win in November of next year. So we have to keep that goal in mind, because as we talked about, Georgia Republican primary voters are 92% wrong direction. Americans are still very heavily wrong direction of the country. They believe that we're not going the right way too. More than half of independents feel this way. Even suburban female voters believe America is not headed in the right direction. So we look at these environmental factors that we have, and we have to remember that this is what it looked like last year too, where we lost a US Senate seat here in Georgia, or at least didn't get the opportunity to pick it back up. Brian Kemp does incredibly well. So just because the environment is good doesn't mean that we're going to win the election next year. Candidate choice and quality matters so much. And that's why I'm so glad we're having this debate as a party of these 10, 12, 14, depends on the day, number of people running for president, because who we pick as our nominee does not need to be who we want to reward or they've been there before. And I'm saying, if you're a Donald Trump voter, that's fine. I voted for Donald Trump twice. But we need to really critically think about, between now and probably Super Tuesday, which is when Georgia votes, who is that person that's going to help us defeat Joe Biden? Who's that individual that's going to help us capitalize on this great tailwind that we have as a party of how people view the country headed in the wrong direction? We talked earlier about inflation being a top issue. Well, it's even more important nationally. It's more important in a general election sense of what voters are focused on. These key voter groups that we need to pull to our team in a general election care about this even more. And if we talk about these topics, if we take the Brian Kemp model of what do people care about, why do they care about it, and then how do I talk to them in a way that they believe that I'm there to help them for it, you get victories like Republican +9, which is what Brian Kemp won by, as opposed to losing by 1, 2, or 3 points in what I believe Georgia is the most important state in the general election of 2024. If a Republican does not win Georgia, there's literally no path on the Electoral College to win. And so we have this environment. Right now, what we call the generic ballot is tied. The same number of people would vote for a generic Republican that would vote for a generic Democrat. You see female voters, which we struggle with, especially at post-Dobbs decision last year, are coming our way. We're only down by 2 points with female voters nationally. A lot of that's driven by non-college educated female voters. And the reason I bring this up is because if we're going to win Congress, if we're going to win the presidency, we're going to take back the US Senate, we have to elect candidates that can relate to the broadest coalition possible in a general election. So thank you all for the opportunity to share here today.